Welcome to Vedas and Vedic knowledge. Especially we're going to be talking about not only Vedas and Vedic knowledge, but Vedic culture as well. So this whole segment of videos will really be about Vedic culture of various types and Vedic knowledge and the process of bhakti. So those three things we will be focusing on. What is bhakti? What is Vedic knowledge? Where does it come from? Why should we trust it? Why should we care about it? And also, what is the culture that surrounds the whole process of bhakti? So these are very interesting topics, and these topics will help us to get a deeper handle on how spiritual life actually works. Spiritual life is something that is not always obvious. We don't always understand exactly how spiritual life works or what the purpose of spiritual activities might be. We generally have a distrust or even a aversion to various kinds of religiousness or spirituality because we see it as being oppressive or backward or trying to water down or remove the basic desires or the basic pleasures of life. But actually, spiritual life is not anti-pleasure, but spiritual life definitely has a different understanding of pleasure than your common everyday person usually understands. Happiness exists, but it exists in two levels. One is on the material level and one is on the spiritual level. On the material level, happiness is something that is very fleeting. It comes and right away we find it's gone. We're not able to hold on to it. And we discover that we need more and more of a particular thing to try to reach to the same level of happiness that we once enjoyed with less in an earlier time. So this is the problem with material happiness. It doesn't fulfill us deeply in the heart, it's temporary, and we find that we need more to get to the same place. And therefore, we are dependent on something outside of us to actually be happy. This is not a good thing. So we should not be dependent on what's outside. So spiritual life tells us about what it is to be internal, how we can be inside ourselves and understand a deeper level of life. So we hope to explore that with this particular group of videos. And what we are going to do here is to particularly focus on something we call the Vedas. And the Vedas are ancient scriptures from India. Originally they were written on little leaves or occasionally on paper. And they describe the nature of the world that we live in. What is this world that we actually inhabit? How does it work? And there were originally 4 Vedas and then 108 Upanishads, 18 Puranas. Those were again expanded into Brahmanas and Aranyakas, and finally even into various kinds of other writings. Out of all these, the cream of the Vedic literature is something called the Srimad Bhagavatam. And the Srimad Bhagavatam was written by the same person that wrote all the other Vedic writings, and his name was Srila Vyasadeva. And he himself described that this Srimad Bhagavatam is the cream of all Vedic information. And therefore, if we want to know what the real goal or the real purpose of all Vedic knowledge is, we should first examine the Srimad Bhagavatam. Of course, the Bhagavad Gita too is a cornerstone of Vedic knowledge. I won't say much more about that particular topic at this time, because there are many topics we're going to explore in this series, and by exploring them we will come to a deeper understanding of the entirety of Vedic knowledge. And Vedic knowledge deals with so many different aspects of the world that we live in. And that's one of the reasons why the Vedas are so important. They really help us to understand the world that we live in, why it is the way it is, what it can mean to us to have true knowledge about the world. Of course, before we actually discuss philosophy on any deep level, I think a word or two is in order about the whole idea that people may have of what is Hinduism, because oftentimes the Vedas are actually connected or coupled with an understanding of what generally people call Hinduism. But Hinduism is a very broad and ill-defined term, and that's why I find it very confusing to use it for the most part. Of course, I have to use it in some ways because it's one of the categories with which modern people think, but I have to at the same time discuss several caveats in using that word Hinduism. First of all, the Vedas never use the word itself in the Vedas. It's not a word from the Vedas. In fact, it's a kind of an umbrella term. The word Hindu comes from the Sindhu River. There was a river, and it was a borderline between the Middle East and India. And on the other side, the Arabic people would pronounce the S in Sindhu with an H instead of an S. So the Sindhu became the Hindu. And therefore people living on the eastern side of the Sindhu River became, you guessed it, Hindus. And it's now become more or less an umbrella term. Just like in our everyday world, we have this understanding that something that generally people call the Abrahamic religions. So Abrahamic religions are, of course, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And what they have in common is the Old Testament. They all have some connection with it, maybe in a different way, but they all have some connection with it. And they all have some connection with each other, but certainly they're not the same religion. And in the same way, Hinduism really is something like maybe 4 or 5 basic subsystems or sub-religions that are within themselves actually religions. In other words, they have a core set of beliefs, they have a core set of practices, they are defined by some defining principles, and that's different than the idea of just simply being aggregated by either location or by some kind of umbrella term. So if I said that someone was an Abrahamic, you wouldn't know whether they were a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian. And most of us would probably agree that those 3 terms, those 3 religions are certainly not exactly the same, and they have a lot of differences in their core beliefs. Of course, they also share some properties, obviously. But the same thing is true with Hinduism, and the 4 principal branches of Hinduism are starting with Vaishnavism, which is the system that we ascribe to. Vaishnavism is actually the system of thinking of Krishna as the original personality of Godhead. And by thinking of Krishna, we worship him. And the purpose of spiritual life is to connect with Krishna. And we try to understand who Krishna is and what he is trying to ask of us. Krishna is understood to be a cowherd boy, and he frolicked in the groves of Vrindavan some 5,000 years ago. Although he was the Supreme Lord, he spent time in this planet, both for our benefit and also to enjoy his own pastimes. And that culture or that religious system which focuses on Krishna as the supreme, that religious system is called Vaishnavism, because it refers not only to Krishna, but also to Vishnu, who has 4 arms and is usually seen on a bed of Seshanaga, which is a multi-headed snake, with his consort Lakshmi. And Vishnu is actually an expansion from Krishna, not the other way around. In most dictionaries and oftentimes in various Hindu and Indian writings, it's claimed that Krishna is an expansion of Vishnu. But actually there's an important verse in Srimad Bhagavatam that puts it the other way around. Ete chamsa kalam pumsam, Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam. That there are many avatars listed, but Krishna is Bhagavan Swayam. He is the original personality of Godhead. So in a future episode of this Vedic culture and knowledge series that we are embarking on here today, in future episodes, we will go further into this concept and show why it is that the Vaishnavas, at least those from the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, understand Vishnu as an expansion of Krishna and not the other way around, and that Krishna is the supreme person, and the process of reawakening our relationship with him is called bhakti. So in a nutshell, that's what Vaishnavism is, and that's of what we will be speaking mostly. Now, that's number 1 in the possible categories under the umbrella term of Hinduism. Number 2 is Shaivism, which actually takes Lord Shiva to be the supreme person, and that's very different. And the process there is also very different. And in doing that, people worship Lord Shiva, and they see him as being the supreme person. So that type of worship and that particular style of worship is called Shaivism. There's another style of worship called Shakta worship, which is the worship of Shiva's wife, who is named Parvati. And by worshiping her, people by worshiping her, people see her as the supreme. In other words, that the supreme is really the supreme material energy. So sometimes people worship the material energy, thinking of it as supreme as well. So whether one thinks of it personified as Durga Devi, or one just thinks of the material energy, in one sense, that's both of those concepts are what we would call Shakta worship. So this is why we distinguish Shakta worship, Shaivism, and Vaishnavism. They have a very different central deity that they encompass and worship, and at the same time, they also have a very different purpose and way to reach that entity or that supreme deity. Now, beyond those 3, Vaishnavism, Shaivism, and Shakta worship, there's a 4th, and that is called Advaita Vedanta. And that type of understanding is called sometimes monism or sometimes Mayavada. And this impersonalism or Mayavada suggests that there is only the supreme Brahman, or the undifferentiated energy that pervades everything. And that style of worship sees all forms as basically somehow fictional, including our present form, including the forms of deities, including Vishnu, including Shiva, including Durga Devi. They see all forms as temporary. And sometimes the practitioners of that particular style of worship, they want to merge with the Supreme. And so these are more or less the 4 basic styles of spiritual focus that are under the wide umbrella term of Hinduism. And that's why The word is kind of troubling, and so that people at least know what category we're talking about the religions of India. But of course, Krishna is not Indian, nor does he belong only to India, nor are there many gods with different names who are fighting amongst each other somewhere in some realm. There's one God, but that God has many different names, and that God also expresses himself in many different ways. And certainly, some practitioners of various religious groups, they know him in different ways, some more completely, and some less completely. So what we hope to talk about is some of these different expressions of the Vaishnava tradition. And we'll see how the Vaishnava tradition relates to these four basic subcategories of Hinduism: Shaivism, which in other words are Vaishnavism, Shaivism, Shakta worship, and Advaita Vedanta. So the next thing I want to talk about, which is probably the most important issue that anyone could have, is why are we paying attention to this Vedic knowledge? These books have come from a long time ago, and they discuss a battle that took place thousands of years ago, and they talk about planets and planetary systems. They talk about the origin of the universe. These books, they describe various kinds of worlds, and they talk about the process of bhakti. Why should we care about it? Why should we take it seriously? But actually we find that we should take it seriously, that the writings of the Vedas, they give us a very consistent and complete picture of the world that we live in. We live in a very mysterious world, and if we look at it carefully, we will begin to see that this world has many things that are difficult to understand. And there's no simple way to come to any final understanding of them by some kind of massive investigation. We see that if we study historically the cultures of the world, that there was at one time, most people agree, that there were various religious views of the world. Where did our world come from? The answers were religious. We saw a world that was full of gods and a world that was full of the activities of humankind, and we didn't have any way of sorting our way through it. We saw disasters and difficulties, and we didn't have any way to figure out what is our place in all of this. How will we know why we're alive, why we die, why there is trouble in the world. But through spiritual life, we begin to understand more about the world that we inhabit. And by understanding more about our world, we begin to put ourselves in perspective. There's a general feeling now that we are living on some speck of dust in the backwater of some gigantic galaxy, which itself is only a speck among other millions of such specks. And everything seems insignificant. We're supposed to be apprised by many learned persons that this actually is supposed to be our humility, that now we realize everything is insignificant. But this kind of humility actually is not exactly something that helps us to come to terms with the world that we live in. Instead, generally, it leads to either a kind of feeling of total insignificance, and it can also lead to a feeling of purposelessness and of not really feeling like anything really matters, whether we are careful about what we do or we're not careful about what we do. Nothing really matters because we're living in a world that has no real purpose. Everything is just disconnected grains in a giant universe full of galaxies and planets floating around. But when we want to talk about authoritative knowledge, we want to talk about knowledge that has some connection with the world around us. We want to see that the knowledge we're hearing about is plausible, first of all, that it does explain the world in a way that without that knowledge we could not understand why things are happening, and that it's self-consistent, that that knowledge is not just saying things in one place and then again in the next phrase undoing those same things somewhere else. That it does have plausible explanations for the important questions that as human beings we find and we raise about the world that we inhabit. And besides those, we want to see that the world that's described by Vedic knowledge is actually expansive, that it actually doesn't just deal with trivialities, or it doesn't leave aside many of the things that we see in everyday life. It doesn't leave those aside. Rather, it gives us an understanding and a framework by which we can weave together this entire experience of the world that we inhabit. We can understand how we came to be here, what the purpose is of things, and by properly understanding the world that we live in, we can understand what we should do in it. And if we understand what we should do in it, we have both purpose and we gain purification, and we eventually discover we have deep realized knowledge, not just theoretical knowledge, but deep realized knowledge. So this is what we really want. We want realized knowledge. Realized knowledge is not the same as theoretical knowledge. Theoretical knowledge is the beginning of realized knowledge, but realized knowledge happens when we put theory into practice and we begin to see that the theory is not just theory, but it is actually a nice representation of the mysteries of how the world works itself out. What is really happening? How reality goes about creating the world that we see around us, and how our interaction with the world around us will create our own future and create the kind of circumstances that not only we will face, but that all those around us will face as well. So no one is an island. We have an effect on others, and others have an effect on us. So we have to be aware of that. And that's why spirituality is not only about some knowledge, but it is also about acting on that knowledge. In other words, it's a practice. And besides that, it definitely has social implications. So that's why we're discussing the philosophy of the ancient Vedas, and we're also talking about the culture of the ancient Vedas, because through interacting with other human beings, we can either accelerate our understanding and our deepening realization of knowledge, or we can hinder it. Either way, we can do either one. So that's why through this series of videos, we will explore, as we've been talking about, basically the philosophy. That'll be the main thing we'll be exploring. We'll, of course, be doing that through interviews and through other media. And so we'll be discussing the philosophy. We will also be discussing the culture. In other words, how does one not just understand this philosophy, but how does one live this philosophy in an association with other people? How do we do more than just talk about it? How do we interact with others? How does it come out in the trappings of culture? Because without culture, we cannot implement a philosophy very deeply. So the original cultures of the world, we see it still, the more ancient cultures, they have a philosophic, a spiritual basis. And there was a reason for that. Because when a person has a philosophical or spiritual basis, then naturally the culture that such a person or such a group of persons produce, that culture has a spiritual fundamental undertone. It's doing something. It's helping us to practically live out that culture. So that's why, besides the philosophy, we'll be discussing the culture of spiritual life. We'll be talking about the music, the art, the drama, the poetry, the dance, and of course, even the food and the clothing or dress. As you'll probably realize as we go on with this, not everyone dresses like I do. It's not required by the process of spiritual life. One does not need to dress in a particular way to prove one's spiritual connection. However, we discover that some of us will dress in a particular way. I particularly dress this way because this is the dress of someone who's in a renounced order of life. And it causes people to ask me questions about spiritual life, which I'm happy to try to answer as best I can. But we have many members in our congregation who dress much as anyone else would, with no particular dress difference than the regular average person might have. And of course, we have festivals where people who usually don't dress in Vaishnava dress, they do dress in Vaishnava dress and participate in that festival. So all these things have an effect, and therefore, by engaging in spiritual life, we are not only learning philosophy, but we're applying the philosophy. And after applying the philosophy, we want to engage with others in a type of social dynamic. And of course, we principally engage with others through the vehicle of culture. So culture is a big part of the vehicle that we interact with the world and we interact with others. So this process of spiritual life, or of bhakti, the process of gradually changing from being not very much focused on the Supreme to being very deeply focused on the Supreme, that gradual change, that change occurs by a process, and that process is called bhakti. Bhakti is the process of gradually becoming undistracted by the various things that we see in this world and becoming more focused on the Supreme. And as we said before, we are from the Vaishnava tradition, so that Supreme is Krishna. He plays a flute. He's described as being darkish, like a monsoon rain cloud. And he is the Supreme. He is called the Avatari. From him, all other avatars and expansions emanate. And by understanding him, we develop eventually an attraction. And all of us have an attraction for God. It's not something that comes from outside. It's something that's natural for us. But because we have decided that we wanted to be in the world, a world without the presence of God, we've chosen to come here, and therefore we are estranged from ourselves, and we're estranged from the person who is the center of everything. So little by little, if we make an effort, we begin to understand what Krishna consciousness is. And we eventually find ourselves very, focused on the Supreme. And as we become more focused on the Supreme, we become able to change our lives in a very significant way. And this happens by degrees, and it happens through a process, as we say, that's just called bhakti. And through this bhakti, we will regain our original relationship with the Supreme Being, who is Krishna. So that's enough for this particular session, and we hope that you will find an interest. If you do, then all the better. we are ourselves making an effort to understand this process of spiritual life. And gradually through the process of spiritual life, we will come to a higher understanding, and we will feel satisfied. And I hope that as we go forward, I will give you not only an understanding of spiritual life, but also the sufficient evidence that will make it seem very realistic to try this path out. At least one should try it out for a month or two. One should give a serious investigation to the process of spiritual life, of bhakti. If one gives a serious investigation to it, then you will see that it is not just some kind of hocus pocus or some ancient dogma, but that these ideas are the real explanation of the world around us. And through understanding them, we will come to a higher commitment to the Supreme, which all the religions talk about. But this is the process to actually do it. So this is our chance to engage in what we call the process of spiritual life. And in this process of spiritual life, by engaging in bhakti, we will feel deeply satisfied. Thank you. And we hope that this is easy to understand. I will try to make it as easy as I can.